I'm Beth Welch, and I wish I'd brought my reading glasses, but it is my great honor to welcome Richard Russo back to the Newburyport Literary Festival. Rick was last here in 2014 when he read from his deeply affecting memoir, Elsewhere, and also graciously accepted the John P. Marquand Prize in American Literature, an honor very close to this Marquand granddaughter's heart. More generally, he is known as the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Empire Falls, just one of his epic novels detailing and revealing the heart of our country, small-town America. Master storyteller, Russo's works include 12 novels, no, Beth, 7 novels, 8 novels. What have I got written down? 8 novels, 2 collections of short stories, and numerous screenplays, one of them co-written with Robert Benton and based on Russo's best-selling novel, Nobody's Fool. In his newest novel, Everybody's Fool, Rick revisits the wide cast of characters of North Bath, New York. If you haven't read it already, you are in for a consummate literary treat. No spoilers from me, but fellow fans of Donald Sullivan, Sully, the bad boy, good-hearted protagonist of Nobody's Fool, will be thrilled by his return and perhaps hope for a trilogy. Everybody, Richard Russo. Woo!
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be back in Newburyport for this festival. Wonderful to see all of you in church. No less. I was telling Beth, I'm trying to recall what's in this, actually, that I'm going to be reading to you from this pulpit. I thought what I would do here today is, since Nobody's Fool was published so long ago, more than 23 years between these two books, and Everybody's Fool was just last year, I thought that what might be kind of fun to do is to read a short passage from each. And then we'll talk about the passage of time. And if you're interested in just, the snapshot of that, just check out the author photo on the back of Nobody's Fool, and then the one on the back of Everybody's Fool, and the ravages of time. Okay, so I'm going to read a couple short passages, tell you a little bit about why in the world, after 23 years you would return in a sequel. And then we'll just open things up to general questions, I guess, and I'll be happy to sign your books. There's an almost godlike echo in here. Are you all hearing okay? And how many times do you hear each word that I'm speaking? Okay, so this first passage is from Nobody's Fool, published in 1992. And there's a symbol in the first little passage here, and I'll just indicate that when I come to it. A block down the street from Hattie's, 2 city workers were taking down the banner that had been strung across Main Street since September, where it had become an object of much discussion and derision. Things are looking in Bath, it said. Some of the town's residents claimed that the banner made no sense because of the arrow. Had a word been left out? Was the missing word hovering midair above the arrow? Clive Peoples, whose idea the slogan had been, was deeply offended by these criticisms and remarked publicly that this had to be the dumbest town in the world if the people who lived there couldn't figure out that the arrow was a symbol for the word up. It worked, he explained, on the same principle as I Heart New York, which everyone knew was the cleverest promotional campaign in the entire history of promotional campaigns, turning a place that nobody even wanted to hear about into a place that everybody wanted to visit. Anybody could see that the slogan was supposed to read, I love New York, not I Heart New York. The heart was a symbol, a shortcut. Well, the citizenry of Bath were not fetched by this argument. To most people, it didn't seem that the word up needed to be symbolically abbreviated, brevity being the word's most obvious characteristic to begin with. After all, the banner stretched all the way across the street, and there was plenty of room for a two-letter word in the center of it. In fact, many of Clive Jr.'s opponents on the banner issue confessed that they were less than taken by the I Heart New York campaign as well. They remained to be convinced that upstate was any better off for it, and now, after 3 months of this new banner, local merchants along Main Street still remained to be convinced that things were looking in Bath either. They were waiting for something more tangible, like the reopening of the Sanssouci or groundbreaking on the Ultimate Escape Fun Park. The new banner, Go Sabertooths, Trounce Schuyler Springs, was even more optimistic. The choice of the word trounce was more indicative of the town's mounting frustration with the basketball team's losing streak to Schuyler Springs than it was a realistic goal. The more traditional beat had been rejected as mundane and unsatisfying. The real debate had been between trounce and annihilate. The proponents of annihilate had surrendered the field when they were reminded that it was, after all, a 10-letter word. And Bath was a town that had recently established a precedent when it abbreviated the word up. The banner also promised to revive another controversy, this one turning on a point of grammar. Nearly 3 decades earlier, when football had to be dropped due to a post-war decline in the region's population and the high school's other sports began to show signs that they could no longer compete successfully with arch-rival Schuyler Springs, the high school's principal had decided that it was time to change the school's nickname, the Antelopes, to something more ferocious, in the hopes of spurring Bath's young athletes to greater ferocity. After all, there weren't any antelope within 1,500 miles of Bath, and all those animals were famous for was running away. So there had been a Name the Team contest, and the Saber-Toothed Tigers were born, all the antelope logos repainted at town expense. Predictably, the whole thing had not turned out well. The fans immediately shortened the name to the Tigers, which the high school principal thought common and uninspiring and a violation of the contest rules. The best thing about the saber-toothed tiger was its saber teeth, which ordinary tigers didn't have. And the principal insisted that the name not be corrupted, even in casual conversation. He had spent good money repainting all those logos, even if the saber teeth had turned out looking like walrus tusks. If all of this wasn't enough, a controversy had erupted on the editorial page of the North Bath Weekly Journal over whether the plural of saber-tooth should be saber-tooths or saber-teeth. When the cheerleaders led the spell cheer, how should it go? Well, the principal said saber-teeth sounded elitist and silly and dental. The chair of the high school's English department disagreed, claiming that this latest outrage was yet another symptom of the erosion of the English language. And he threatened to resign if he and his staff were expected to sanction tooths as the plural of tooth. Why not? The public librarian had asked in the next letter to the editor. Wasn't this, after all, the same English department that had sanctioned antelopes as the plural of antelope? The letters continued to pour in for weeks. Borough peoples who had nurtured a 20-year grudge against the principal for caving in and allowing history courses in the junior and senior high school to be redesignated social studies, had the last editorial word, reminding her fellow citizens that the saber-toothed tiger was an extinct animal. Food, she suggested, for thought. So that was from Nobody's Fool, 1992. So flash forward now, 10 years in fictional time. 10 years has elapsed since the events of the earlier novel. 23 years, or a little more, has elapsed in authorial time and reader time. So, a decade of fictional time, over 2 decades in our time. You can just imagine what, the changes that take place over such a long period of time. So this is from Everybody's Fool, 2016. A banner was strung across Main Street for the Memorial Day weekend. The New Bath, it said, partnering for tomorrow. This was the brainstorm of Gus Moynihan, the town's new mayor, who had been swept into power the previous year on a tidal wave of born-again optimism, more than a decade after the demise of the Ultimate Escape Fun Park, an economic catastrophe that had ushered in a golden age of self-loathing and fiscal pessimism deeply rooted in 2 centuries' worth of invidious comparison to Schuyler Springs, its better-looking twin and age-old rival. Schuyler had long possessed everything to which Bath aspired: a vibrant local economy, an educated citizenry, visionary leadership, throngs of seasonal downstate visitors, an NPR affiliate radio station. Okay, sure, there had been some shitty luck involved. Bath's mineral springs had mysteriously dried up over a century ago while Schuyler's continued to percolate up enthusiastically from its shale. Schuyler also had a famous thoroughbred racetrack, an acclaimed writer's retreat, and a center for the performing arts. A high-toned liberal arts college. Bath had only a beleaguered 2-year community college, as well as a dozen fancy restaurants that served exotic foods like ramps, whatever they were. On the restaurant front, all Bath could boast was the rundown Roadhouse Tavern, the White Horse, Hattie's Lunch, a donut shop, and the new Applebee's out by the freeway exit. What all this amounted to, everybody agreed, was a complete economic and cultural rout. For a while, the fun park had gotten people's hopes up, but when they were dashed, the collective despair had been so profound that the town had even stopped stringing those buoyantly optimistic Main Street banners that had become its dubious trademark, the last of which had read, "Things are looking in Bath." The gloom had lasted until Gus Moynihan, a retired college professor who was renovating one of the grand old Victorians on Upper Main Street, wrote a guest newspaper editorial decrying the town's mordant defeatism and criticizing the current Republican administration's unspoken policies, which could be summed up, he claimed, in 9 words. No spending. None. Ever. On anything. Under any circumstances. Why not string one last banner across the street, he suggested. It would read, "Let's eat dirt." Well, the editorial struck a chord and made a mayoral candidate of its author. Even his opponents had to admit that Gus and his cronies, many of them from away, had run a clever campaign. Let's be Schuyler Springs was the gist of it. Instead of competing with their obnoxious neighbor, why not take advantage of its proximity? Half of the people who came to the racetrack and performing arts center in the summer had no place to stay and ended up in hotels as far away as Schenectady. Why shouldn't they stay in Bath? Okay, the Sans Souci Hotel and Resort, with its nearly 300 rooms, had run into legal difficulties. Fueled by local resentment, when it became known that the new owners would be using downstate contractors and labor for almost everything. The old hotel's lavish renovations had cost far more and taken much longer than expected, causing the hotel to miss much of the summer tourist trade that first season, and the locals steadfastly rebelled against the prices of its fancy restaurant. But that didn't mean the whole concept was flawed, or so the Moynihan crowd had argued. Instead of throwing up roadblocks to entrepreneurship, the town should have offered tax breaks and other incentives. Same deal with restaurants. During the short summer season, desperate, hungry travelers even mobbed the horse. So why not entice a young chef or two up from New York City? Find out what the hell ramps were. And serve them if that's what people really craved. It wasn't like Schuyler Springs had cornered the world ramps market and refused to share. Overnight, the new byword was partnering. Whenever possible, Bath would partner not only with odious Schuyler Springs and moneyed downstaters, but also with local entrepreneurs in projects of exceptional merit. One of these locals was Carl Roebuck, who most people were surprised to learn was an entrepreneur, having known him all their lives as a con man and an asshole. Carl's father, Kenny, they had liked. He had built tip-top construction up from nothing by working 14-hour days. Like so many men of his generation, he hoped that his son wouldn't have to work quite so hard. On this score, he had no legitimate worries. In college, Carl had learned to drink and seduce women and spend his father's money, and to loathe all things Carhartt, especially the brand's connotation of hard, honest labor. He gave, and returning home, he gave no indication that he meant to do work of any kind, if he could help it. Okay, that's everybody's. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is, I think, actually my last event with this particular book. I've got a collection of stories coming out in a couple of days, and I'll be on the road with that. So with regard to Everybody's Fool, I've been on the road flogging this now for a little over a year, and I'm gonna answer the first question before you ask it, because during this year I've learned what it's going to be, and that is, why in the world would you write a sequel 23 years after the original? I mean, it's not that unusual for literary writers to write sequels. I mean, Updike did it every decade or so, right, with the Rabbit books. Larry McMurtry has a habit of going back to his character of Dwayne, who first appeared in the Last Picture Show every decade or so to check in on him. But 23 years does seem an excessively long period of time to wait, and that's and I had no intention of really ever doing this, of ever going back and revisiting these characters from this particular novel. Although, well, really the reason that I did, the ostensible reason for doing this was my friend Howard Frank Mosier, whose work I'm sure that many of you know. One of our worst losses. Last year was a bad year for losses in the literary community, and Howard Frank Mosier was not one of the most famous of those writers, but he was the nearest and dearest to my own particular heart. I loved Howard deeply, and this book was Everybody's Fool is dedicated to Howard because, over the 2 decades plus of our friendship, Howard offered me my first blurb on Mohawk back in what would that have been, 84, I think, somewhere around there. Howard was the first real writer to read a book of mine and say something nice about it, and we had a friendship, a long-lasting friendship ever since. And after Nobody's Fool came out, Howard took a particular liking to Rub, Sully's sidekick, in the earlier book, and whenever we would run across each other, which we did as often as we could on the road, if he was if he was touring with a book or I was touring with a book, and up in Vermont, we would see each other whenever we could. And Howard would always ask me, "What's new with Sully and Rub?" As if they were real people, and I had just Skyped with them like last week or something, and so I was, of course, a pretty constant disappointment to Howard over a period of about 25 years, over 20 years anyway, until about close to a decade ago, my wife Barbara and I were at a dinner party, and this somebody told a wonderful story about a neighbor. They lived out in the boonies, and this neighbor had been promising that he was going to prune a branch from the tree that was outside his wife's bedroom window. And a friend of his was supposed to come over with a ladder and help him do this, but apparently forgot. And this guy had been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And finally, that day when his wife went to work, he said, that he would prune it that day. By the time she got home from work, the branch would be pruned. But his friend didn't show up, and rather than face his wife, he did what anyone would do. Well, maybe not anyone. Maybe only him. What he did was he got the chainsaw that he had rented the day before and a length of rope, and he tied one end of the rope to the handle of the chainsaw, and he tied the other end of the rope to his belt, right? And nailed a couple of sections of 2x4 to the trunk of the tree in lieu of a ladder, and climbed up into the tree, kind of hand over fist, until he got to the offending limb about 30 feet off the ground, and climbed onto the limb. And of course, he's facing the wrong way, so then you have to kind of, grabbing the trunk, you have to kind of get around so that your back, you have to kind of picture this, so that your back is up against the trunk of the tree, because you really have to be sitting on the limb that you're going to prune, because otherwise you need 3 hands. You need 2 for the chainsaw and 1 to grab hold of the trunk of the tree so that you don't fall. The only other thing you can do is sit on the limb with your back to the trunk of the tree, which this guy did. And then he hauled up the chainsaw, as you would, as he would, and spread his legs as far as possible, and revved up the chainsaw and sawed the limb. The limb goes to the ground, hits the ground, and only then does he consider his predicament. Because in order to climb down now, he needs the limb that's on the ground to be where it used to be, which is right in front of him, because in order to rotate on the limb, in order to climb back down, you need that limb, because there's nothing up here, and there are a couple of branches below you, but you can't, there's no way that you can get down to them. So here he is, and he does what he can do, which is, untie the chainsaw and let the rope go to the bottom, and there's nothing really much for him to do except wait for his wife to come home 5 hours later, which ultimately she did. Well, anyway, I heard this wonderful story, and I'm drawn, as those of you who have read my books know, you know that I'm drawn to human folly, right? So I was told this story, and it wasn't that long after that I ran into Howard again, and Howard said, "What's new with Sully and Rub?" And I said, "Well, Rub did this dumb thing," and I told the story as if it was Rub Squeers who had done this thing, and Sully was the friend who was supposed to go over and pick him up, supposed to come over with the ladder, and it's a two-man job, and Sully was the one, and I made it Sully, of course, instead of the wife, who's the one who finds him, weeping after sitting for 6 hours on a nub of a branch in this tree. But what happened was, in telling the story that I had heard at the dinner party, and telling it as a Rub Squeers, Donald Sullivan story, I realized just how much fun it was to be back in that world again, and so decided to do what I'd never done before, was to write this sequel. Once I got going, I realized, though, that there were much more compelling reasons to write this book than to just pay Howard Frank Mosher off on a long overdue debt of telling him what was new with Rub. As soon as I started working on it, the dividends began to pay off almost immediately. I never really made any bones of the fact that Donald Sullivan was based, at least in large part, based on my own father, and so resurrecting the character was a lot like resurrecting my own old man and having his company again for another 5 years or so during the time that I was writing this book. And my father and mother separated when I was a kid, and I didn't really get to know him until I was much older. I became interesting to him when I was old enough to drink. And at the time in New York State, that was at age 18, and that's when my father and I started hanging out and really became friends. After really most of my childhood, he was more or less estranged, and I got to know him during that period of time. But of course, by then I was already off to the university and trying to learn how to become a writer. And it wasn't very long after that when he was diagnosed with cancer and died shortly thereafter. And so when I was writing Nobody's Fool, it was a lot. I just kind of never got my fill of the man. He was gone for the first 18 years of my life, pretty much, and then we had not much more than a decade together, seeing each other sporadically. And so I just kind of never got my fill of the guy, and he was a wildly entertaining man. And so when I was writing Nobody's Fool, it was like having him around again, swapping lies, as we used to do in the bars. And that was what writing Nobody's Fool was like. Well, when it came time to write Everybody's Fool 23 years later, now I'm suddenly the age that he was when he was first diagnosed, and wondering that if I were to go back and start and revive that character, and he couldn't be 23 years older, because that would have meant that Sully, who was 60 at the time, would have been deep in his 80s. And the whole trick to Sully as a character is that here's a guy who is always in motion. Since coming back from the war, he's kind of a haunted man in a lot of ways, and the way that he copes with regret, which is to ignore it, is to always stay on the move, never rest, never sit down, never think. I just couldn't imagine Sully at age 83 still having the kind of mobility that I wanted him to have, because I didn't want to steal his freedom from him. So 10 years was about as far into the future as I could go with this book, and still have Sully be a man who would not be compromised by illness or really anything else. I wanted to catch him on his last great adventure. But as soon as I started work on the novel and succeeded in securing for the next 5 years or so my father's company again, I hadn't written more than a scene or two before I realized that during those 23 years, I had lost sole ownership of that character, because, of course, in the interim, Paul Newman had played him in that wonderful movie. Which is the reason, I think, by the way, that movie, I don't think anybody was, at 23 years later, was dying for a sequel to Nobody's Fool, or would have been, had it not been for that movie. Because I think over the years, I mean, some of you may have reread Nobody's Fool, but probably many more, have, over the years, seen that movie once or twice. And Newman's portrayal of Sully is part of, those of you who have seen the movie, is probably part of your memory of the character in my novel, which is not terribly surprising for you, but it surprised me a little to discover that it was also true of me. And so now in writing Everybody's Fool, I was not only spending time with my deceased father, I was also spending time with a deceased Paul Newman. So I was kind of able to revive two people that I cared about deeply, and that's really what led me to understand that the whole thing was going to be a book about memory. It was going to be a book about those people who, when they're gone, aren't really gone. For as long as we're around, they're around. So certain things became obvious when you realize that. If it's a book about memory, the earlier book had been taken place all over 2 holiday weekends, Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a winter's tale, and I wanted this to be a summer's tale. Well, if it's a book about memory, why not Memorial Day weekend? Why not make that the kind of structural element of the book? Miss Burrell, who has been dead for 10 years at the opening of the new book, is still very much alive. The renovations of the old junior high school where she taught so lovingly for all those years is being rededicated in her name. And of course, Jessica Tandy, who portrayed her so memorably in the movie, is also now gone. And of course, I was about 250 pages into Everybody's Fool when we got the terrible news about Philip Seymour Hoffman, who played in one of his first really commercial movies. He had a very small role, but as they say about these things, there are no small roles, only small actors. And during the writing of Everybody's Fool, of course, I was thinking about Philip and kind of channeling not only my old character, but also Philip Seymour Hoffman in the role, and also because he was also in Empire Falls. I got the HBO miniseries of Empire Falls. I got to know him a little bit better there, and when we got the terrible news of his death, my thought was, in addition to my sorrow for the loss of this actor's actor, was thinking to myself, just from the point of view of a creator, because I'd really been thinking, not that I thought that there would be a movie made of this book or that he would star in it. The odds against that were pretty long. It's just that he was so much the spirit of the character that I was writing about, and then to lose him, and you think, what do you do? Do you start imagining another character who might play the role in order to continue? And finally, I just thought, no, to hell with it. I mean, this character is coming to life by my channeling this actor who would have been perfectly cast in the role. And so I just went with that throughout the rest of the book, all the way through to the last page. Every line of Raymer's dialogue in this book was a line that I imagined Philip Seymour Hoffman delivering. And there never was, I think, in that I can remember, an actor that I ever met anyway, that was so vulnerable as a human being, just so vulnerable, so inclined not to think terribly well of himself, as Philip Seymour Hoffman was. And of course, that's the essence of Raymer. Here is a man who believes the very worst things that everybody says about him, and you could just see that in Philip. So, in writing this book, as I said, the dividends began to pay off almost immediately, and were there. It's not to say that I didn't run into problems. I ran into enormous problems in writing this book, but for the most part, what a joy to be given a book like this, where you can go back in and spend time with people, both real and imagined, that have meant something to you down the years. So, Howard, thank you. And thank all of you. Thank you for coming today. And if you have a few questions, I'm pretty nimble. I've been on the tour with this book for a long time now, so I'm pretty nimble at dodging, I think, any questions that you might want to that you might want to ask. Sir, in the back, I saw your hand first. I missed the key word in your first sentence. In literary fiction, what? Oh God, I hope this didn't appear literary to you. I go to great pains actually to remove anything in it to remove anything from any book of mine that would remind you of literature. No, I'm obviously being glib and silly. Like most literary writers, I do think of myself, I suppose, as a literary writer. But as I see it, and this is something you can correct me on if you want, but as I see it, my relationship to you good people who read my books is to do as much of the heavy lifting as possible on my end, and then to remove anything that is going to make your journey fraught in any way. And ideally, what I would love to happen with you folks is that you get into a novel of mine, you lose yourself completely, you don't stop to think if there's a sentence you particularly like, you don't stop to think about that, because you're anxious, hopefully, to get to the next sentence and what's going to happen to these characters that you feel something for. And ideally, for me at least, what would happen is that when you set the book down at the end, or maybe the next day after you finished it, it dawns on you that maybe there was something actually going on in this book that would suggest it belongs in among the works of other literary writers. But I'm trying as hard as I can in terms of process, and especially during revision, to take anything in terms of diction, elaborate subordinate sentence structure, anything that would cause you to read the sentence, go back and read it again and say, now that's a great sentence. That's the last thing in the world I would want you good people to be doing. And later on, if you think about the book and you think, well, there's really more going on in that book than I was paying an awful lot of attention to earlier on, that would please me enormously. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, we did 3 movies together. The two that people know are Nobody's Fool, and then of course he played Max Roby in the HBO miniseries of Empire Falls. In between, we did a detective movie together called Twilight, not the vampire one. And it was actually, you can Netflix it probably. Lovely movie starring Newman and Susan Sarandon and James Garner and Gene Hackman. So we worked together. We worked together on those 3 films. But Paul really, really enjoyed the company of writers, and not certain. I mean, I know he was fond of me because we worked on those things together. But he would also call from time to time. One of the first calls that I got after winning the Pulitzer was from Paul. But he was like that he really loved the printed page. I remember when I first met him on the set of Nobody's Fool, he brought me over to the trailer just because he started just questioning me, drilling me really about things about Sully that might be helpful to him that weren't in the novel. And so he wanted to know what kind of music he listened to and all this. At some point, I said, "Yes, Paul, I've already told you so much more than I know." Because almost everything that I knew about him was in the novel, as a matter of fact. But he seemed to think that there was some hidden store of knowledge that I had about him. That if he just kept badgering me long enough, I would surrender the thing that would be of additional use. He would call me. From time to time, and he usually didn't have much use for the formalities of beginning a conversation. I would pick up the phone and say hello, and I would hear his voice got deeper and deeper and more gravelly as he got older. I would answer the phone, and I would hear a voice say, "Hot shot," which was Paul, and it was his favored term of endearment for. Especially, I think especially men who were younger than he was. But it was just a term of endearment. He called a lot of people hot shot. And I don't know whether it was because he was having trouble remembering their names or because lately I have adopted similar strategies. But that's what he would always say, hot shot. And he would call me often after a book had come out and he'd read it and he'd say, "Good book." I will say this about him. It's not like I don't want to suggest that we were intimate friends or anything like that, but there is in the new book of stories coming out, the final story. It's a long story, novella length actually, in which I've had a chance to kind of remember him a little bit. In this character Wendell, everybody calls him Wendy, but Paul was one of the real genuine people in Hollywood in an industry not known for the genuine. And when Paul knew he was ill, but nobody else did, he was thinking about doing this movie, and he sent me the book that it was based on, and they already had a script for it, and the script wasn't very good. And he asked me if I would take a run at it, but I was right in the middle of writing my novel, Bridge of Sighs, and I couldn't. But when I finished Bridge of Sighs, I had read the book and zipped Paul a quick email and said, "You know what? I just don't see this. I don't see where your role is in this." And I said, "But I have an idea." And for just about a week, I wrote the first act of this caper movie for Paul that involves an aging con man. And it was shortly after that and Paul read the pages and called me right back and said, I would love to do this and I would love to encourage you, but I'm not going to be making movies anymore. And he didn't say anything more about it. And I had heard a rumor, by that time I had heard a rumor that he was ill. And he didn't say anything about it, refused to say anything about the fact that he was sick. He just said that he knew at this point that he wasn't going to be making movies anymore. But when it came time to write this novella, one of the things that I was able to do was to take the first act of that screenplay, and the novella goes back and forth between the story of this movie that people are trying to make and the screenplay itself. So you go back and forth between them, and it was a chance for me to remember Paul as a genuine human being in Hollywood who treated people honestly and decently and well, when in an industry where not very many people do. Yeah. I don't like adapting my own work very much. I really loved the HBO miniseries of Empire Falls, but I thought that they really needed to hire another screenwriter. I wrote the screenplay, but at that point I had worked on the novel for 5 years, and then I had gone on the road to tour with it for a little over a year. And geez, there came a point where I couldn't remember my life before Empire Falls, and I was deeply exhausted. I wanted to start a new book, but it turned out if I didn't write it, chances are it wasn't going to get made. So I wrote it, and I loved all those performances. I thought the director, Fred Skepsey, was terrific. The performers all brought, Helen Hunt and Newman, and God, Ed Harris I thought was wonderful as Miles. The cast was just remarkable. My one reservation about the entire thing was that I thought that they really needed to hire a different writer, because I was tired, and I solved the artistic problems of the movie kind of in the same way that I did the novel. So I was not enamored of my own contribution to that, although I loved everybody else's. I do like adapting other people's work, and I like writing original screenplays. The big thing for me is that my strong suit as a writer is my ear. Dialogue is something that I gravitate towards, and I like putting characters in motion. Characters like Sully and Raymer, just get them out in the world and let them act. The things that my weaknesses as a writer, I think, is my eye is not nearly as good as my ear. And it takes me a lot longer to get the details of the physical world when I'm writing a novel, to get those right, than it does. Sometimes dialogue for me is just like taking dictation. I can't write fast enough. And also, I have to work really hard at getting inside people's heads to relay their thoughts. I like to make it more, whatever they're thinking, I like to come out of their dialogue, and I have to remind myself, no, go inside their heads, give us what they're thinking. But of course, in the movies, you don't have to do either of those things. Don't waste any time describing the real world, because the camera is going to do that. And the camera is not going to go inside anybody's head, so there's no reason for you to. So for me, writing screenplays is kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free card, because it plays to my strengths, and I can forget my weaknesses for a while. So I really enjoy doing that, but generally, after I write a screenplay, then I love to go back to my real job, writing novels. And then when I go back, I'm always thrilled to then have those other tools in my toolkit and go back and do the kinds of things that novelists do, as opposed to the more limited scope, I think, of technically the more limited scope of screenwriting. Yes, maybe we're running out of time here, so I think maybe one more question. Yeah. I can be funny. I can be funny given enough time. I am one of those people who generally thinks the following morning what he should have said the previous night. And I think a lot of comic writers are comic writers. If they could do stand up, they would, and we can't, and so we do this. We're also, a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to write the introduction to the Everyman edition of Mark Twain's nonfiction. And his nonfiction is a lot like fiction. It's actually fiction, I think, most of it. And Twain had this, maybe the first, at least American writer, who was kind of a performer first and a writer second. And he used to just, I mean, most of the things that we think of now as the most iconic passages of Twain's fiction and nonfiction, he used to try those things out in front of live audiences night after night after night, and he would learn what worked and what didn't. With each successive performance, he would track where the laughs were and where the audience's attention seemed to drift. For comic writers, at least, that's a very valuable tool, because not only to know what's funny is when people laugh. If they're not laughing, there's a pretty good chance it's not funny. But also timing. Just you don't get that by going off and writing in a cabin in the woods. You know, you're never going to work. Your timing is never going to get better as a result of solitude, right? So, was I funny as a kid? I used to think I was. My teachers certainly never shared that opinion, and made very clear to me that that if I thought I was funny, I was pretty much alone in the room. But it took me, I think, the last thing that came to me in discovering who I might be as a writer was exactly that, discovering that I have basically a comic view of the world, and that's kind of more in the Shakespearean sense than the sitcom comedy show sense. I'm a comic writer because basically I'm cautiously pretty optimistic as a human being, and my general drift. I mean, my novels, no matter how dark they get, people at the end of them tend to get really small victories that are very important to them. And I think when I started out, when I was learning the use of my tools as a writer, I had an idea of myself probably as a tragic writer. I wanted to be taken seriously. And I mean, really, who doesn't want to be taken seriously? But it didn't occur to me that comedy might be the way to be taken seriously. And so the idea that a comic view of life is not inconsistent with literature was the final thing that I had to realize before I could become the writer that it seems to me now at 67, looking back at the course of my work, it seems to me that was, if I was going to be a writer, that was the kind of writer I was going to be. But I almost didn't discover it because I was so determined to be an entirely different kind of writer altogether. Yeah? Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I know some of you would probably like to get books signed, and we're coming to the end of our allotted time together. I can't thank you enough again for coming today and being such a warm audience. Thank you.